Hi friends, my name is Katya. This is Kat Reads a Lot. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is so exciting. We have reached the end of 2023, which means that it's time for my list of my favorite books that I read this year. I read some really fantastic books this year, some that are definitely going to be all-time favorites. I read 75 books this year, which is actually a little bit lower than usual. This is the first year in the last 3 years that I haven't read 100 books. I didn't quite hit 100, and honestly I didn't think that I was going to hit my goal of 75, but I'm really proud of myself for still hitting it, even though I had a much busier year than years past. I started school again. I'm in my first year of law school, which has been stressful but also really fun and rewarding. The majority of the books that I read are contemporary fiction, romance, and fantasy. So I think I'm not going to do a specific ranking for my favorite books of the year because that is just too difficult. Every single year I tell myself that I'm going to try to rank them in order, but it's always just an impossible task. So I'm gonna go by genre, and then you can click around to the timestamps to see like what your favorite genre of book is, and hopefully you'll be able to get a recommendation from my 2023 list. So I'm gonna start off with just general fiction. The first book that I'm gonna talk about is Homegoing by gyasi. This book is so beautifully, masterfully written. We follow a family across generations, and honestly, I was a little bit nervous going into this book because every single chapter follows a different character. And knowing that going in and knowing how characters are so like the most important thing to me when I'm reading typically, I really thought that it would be difficult to get to know every single character and to become attached to every single character, but I did not have to worry because gyasi does such a fantastic job of really making every single character so vibrant and flawed and making me so invested in every single one of them, even though we're only with every character for a short period of time. We're only with every character for a single chapter. The first two chapters follow two sisters who end up on two very different paths. So each chapter following those two follows one of the sisters' children. So it's the sisters, their children, their children's children, their children's children, and you just follow them throughout the generations. This book is powerful and heartbreaking and beautifully written, and it's the kind of book that makes history feel so close. Like, I never think about my great-grandparents or my great-great-grandparents, but this book really illustrates just how much the decisions and the circumstances and the things that you choose to do and the things that happen to you affect not only you, but affect like where your children grow up and what your children's circumstances are and how that affects their children and how everything is tied and connected. The way that the book ties everybody and connects everybody together by the end was so powerful. It was on a technical level like so impressively written, and then also on an emotional level so moving. This author has only written 2 books so far, Homegoing and then Transcendent Kingdom, and they have both been glowing 5-star reads for me, and I am just so desperate for her to write another book because I love them. My next favorite general fiction book that I read this year was My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This came out a few years ago, I think in 2017. We follow our main character Vanessa on 2 timelines. So in one, it's the year 2000, she's 15 years old, she is having an affair with her high school English teacher, and then flash forward present day, that English teacher is now being accused by many other students, including current students, of sexual misconduct. And so we flash back and forth between these 2 timelines as Vanessa is kind of coming to terms with the nature of their relationship. When she was 15, she really viewed it as a very like romantic, special relationship, and now she's really grappling with the fact that she was a victim in that situation and that she should never have been in a relationship when she was 15 years old with a 42-year-old man. So it's really heartbreaking, difficult to read at times, but also just so powerful. Vanessa as a character is so flawed. I saw a Goodreads review where somebody was talking about how this book really emphasizes that there's no wrong way to be a victim, because even though Vanessa doesn't always believe herself to be a victim, and even though she really kind of pushes back on the idea that this relationship that she was in when she was in high school was something that was inappropriate, she still has such a powerful story. So it's definitely something that's really thought-provoking and one that stands out to me as one of my favorite books of the year. Next genre, we'll move on to nonfiction. First book that I have to talk about is Know My Name by Chanel Miller, which is a beautifully written really heartbreaking memoir about a woman who is navigating not only the trauma of being sexually assaulted, but also of going through a trial after the fact, and how she is consistently belittled and not believed, and how much strength she has to kind of stand up to a system that is not really designed to protect her in any way. Chanel Miller for a long time was known as Emily Doe, the girl who was sexually assaulted on the Stanford campus by Brock Turner. And now in this memoir, it's her story of, like I said, trauma and pain, but also of resilience, and how she is more than just a victim. I feel like I've been saying this about every single book that I've described so far, but it is so powerful and beautifully written. I went into this book with very high expectations because it's one that I've been meaning to read for a while, but I was always intimidated to read because of the subject matter. But it's really, really good. And if you like memoirs, it's definitely one that I would recommend. One more nonfiction, Why Fathers Cry at Night by Kwame Alexander. This is a collection of poetry and prose and recipes, and it kind of follows his life, but not in any sort of specific linear way. It's mostly just different remembrances. So there's not necessarily like a clear storyline or plot that you're following. And I didn't love like every single poem in the book, but the ones that affected me really affected me deeply. I felt so moved by a lot of the poems in this book, and I felt really connected, especially to some of his breakup poems. Not to get like too personal about my 2023, but it was just a book that I really read at the right time. I really enjoyed this. Also, the author mentioned a lot of different like musicians and songs throughout the book, and would talk about how when you make this recipe you should listen to this album and it'll take this amount of songs time. And so I would turn on that music as I was reading the book, and it made for a really like pleasant, immersive reading experience. I didn't read that much poetry this year, but I'm definitely looking forward to reading more next year. Okay, moving forward into our next genre, fantasy. One of my favorite fantasy books that I read this year was Jade City by Fonda Lee. This book takes place on the island of Cape Con, which is a place where people can use magical jade to give themselves superpowers, basically, or like superhuman abilities. Cape Con is the only producer of this magical jade that you can wear either on your body, or some of the characters embed it into their skin. And if you have the right heritage, the right training, it'll give you these like superhuman abilities. And the two families that we follow are like basically the only people who can really use it. It's not super common to be able to wield jade, but in the beginning of the book there is this new drug that's discovered that is allowing people who typically would not have been able to use jade to use jade. And so you have like a lot more people being able to have these superhuman abilities, and it's causing a lot of tension and instability. And what I loved in particular about this book was that we're mostly following one family, the Cole family, and the relationships between all of the different siblings and their dynamics and their struggles for power. I found it to be so gripping and action-packed and fascinating to read. I really loved it. I don't always read a lot of like darker fantasy, if that makes sense. Ones with more heavy, harrowing themes. This was a lot heavier, violent fantasy than the other fantasy books on this list, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm so excited to read the rest of the books in the series next year. Next is Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This book follows our main character, Tress. She lives a very simple, quiet life. I found her to be a very relatable main character. She just wants to have like a simple homebody kind of existence, but when her true love goes missing, she has to go on a quest to try to save him. Tonally, this book reminded me a lot of The Princess Bride, especially in the narrator, who would so often like make little humorous asides to the reader and just break the wall and speak directly to you, which I really enjoyed. Tress as main character, like I said, was so much fun to read about, and even though it was definitely a very like cozy, adventurous, more calm fantasy, if that makes sense, than I'm used to reading from Brandon Sanderson, it still kept me so engaged and turning the page, and it was just a really delightful kind of folktale, fairy tale kind of story to me. And plus the edition that I read had these really beautiful illustrations, so it was just a really fun reading experience overall. And then the last fantasy book that I'm going to talk about I have right over here, and that is Percy Jackson and the Chalice of the Gods by Rick Riordan. I was so excited to read this book. This is the first reunion that we have have of Percy and Grover and Annabeth going on a quest as a trio since the very first series. I have so much nostalgia for this series. I have now read every single book, some of them multiple times, and honestly, in the more recent books, like the Trials of Apollo books, even the Nico, the Sun and the Star book, I found myself a little bit let down. And so I went into this very hesitantly with low expectations, but it felt like such a good return to what made the original 5-book series so good. The humor, the adventure, the heart, I just had a really good time with it. We follow Percy as he is trying to get recommendations to be able to go to college. Now, for some reason, Percy needs recommendation letters to get into this university, which is, as far as we know, the only university that Greek and Roman demigods can go to. But the gods will not write letters of recommendation for him unless he does new quests. Apparently the quests that he did in all of the previous books leading up to this were not enough for him to be accepted into college. So these books, this new series, follows Percy as he embarks on new quests just so that he can try to get into college so that he and Annabeth can go to college together. So it seems like the books are going to be really low stakes, all things considered, especially this one, but it was just so delightful and pleasant and fun to read, and I just really loved it. And like I said, I liked being reunited with that original trio from that original series. It was really fun to spend more time with Grover and Annabeth in particular, and I really loved it. Okay, my next genre is romance. I have so many romances that I loved this year, so this is my biggest category. First book that I'm going to talk about is Check and Mate by Ali Hazelwood. This is a YA rom-com from Ali Hazelwood, but it definitely veers toward the older side of YA, like almost veering on new adult. I know that a lot of times people read YA romances because they expect them to be cleaner, less spice, closed door kind of situation, maybe not even like discussions of sex, but this one is definitely a little bit more explicit, so I feel like that's good to know going in. But this book feels like if you combined Better Than the Movies, which is one of my favorite YA rom-coms and one that I mentioned because I know that it's very popular, and The Queen's Gambit. If you like rom-coms and you like chess, this is the book for you. This book follows our main character, Mallory, who very reluctantly agrees to join her friend's chess competition because there was somebody who dropped out and she needed somebody to fill in. But she ends up kind of accidentally beating one of the best chess players in the world. And from there, she plays competitive chess throughout the rest of the book and falling in love with that aforementioned best chess player in the world. This book I absolutely could not put down. I had so much fun with it. I loved the characters. I loved learning more about chess. This book isn't just about the romance, but also about Mallory's rise through the chess world and about her consistently being underestimated and discriminated against because she's a woman in a very male-dominated industry. And so sometimes that was frustrating to read, but the way that Mallory triumphs is so rewarding, so fun. I read this so fast. I was absolutely glued to the audiobook. I definitely recommend this one on audio. And yeah, I really loved it. It made me want to learn how to play chess. Next romance I have to talk about is Happy Place by Emily Henry. Of course, this book was going to be on this list. This book follows our two main characters, Wynne and Harriet. It's a second chance fake dating kind of romance because Wynne and Harriet go on a vacation together with their friends. Every single year they go up to one of the friends' cabins, and on this year's trip, our main character Harriet really feels like people have drifted more than she's used to. Everybody's lives seem to be in much different places, and it's something that she's having some difficulty with. She and Wynne have been together for a really long time, but they broke up a few months ago and none of them have told their friends yet. And because of some things that happen in the first few chapters, they decide to not tell their friends that they've broken up and instead to pretend to still be together. So the book takes place on two different timelines, one in the past where Wynne and Harriet are falling in love with each other and we as readers are finding out why they fell in love in the first place, and then in the present day where they're pretending to be in love and kind of unpacking what led to their breakup to begin with. This book was so moving and honestly kind of relatable. Harriet has some indecisive tendencies, some doormat tendencies. She really, for the most part, allows other people's opinions and other people's thoughts about how she should live her life affect her almost too much. And that's why I say that it can be a little relatable. It hit a little close to home at times. I also really loved Wynne as a character, and I loved their friend group and the way that Emily Henry really delved into how difficult it can be to keep ties and keep the same kind of dynamic in a friend group as time goes on, and how important it is to really put thought and care into those relationships. So I liked how many different like layers and levels there were to this story, and it's probably my second favorite Emily Henry book now, after People We Meet on Vacation. Another second chance romance that I really loved this year was Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan. This book is a really moving and emotional story about Yasmin and Josiah, who were married, now divorced, learning to fall in love again. I feel like something that's so tricky with second chance romances sometimes is that the reader really has to understand and believe both that they broke up for a good reason and that they're getting back together for a good reason, and that they have fixed whatever broke them up in the first place. And that was maybe my only negative about Happy Place, is that a lot of their breakup was just miscommunication. But in Before I Let Go, the reason that they broke up was so hard. I don't even know if I can like talk about it too much without spoiling things, but the reason that they ended up divorcing had a lot to do with tragedies that were happening in their lives and their very different ways of processing grief, and how that kind of tore apart their relationship. And so them getting back together had not only to do with them really coming to terms with their own emotions and their own grief, but also learning to understand the way that the other person processed the world. And so not only were they coming to understand themselves better, they were connecting on a more deep emotional level, and they both kind of put in effort to really try to understand the other person. And I feel like that made for such a deeply moving emotional romance, where I completely believed that they were committed to making the relationship work. Like I said, so moving, so emotional, so loved this. Next is one that I read very, very recently, and that is Out on a Limb by Hannah Bonam-Young. I love this book so much. We follow our two main characters, Win and Bo. They have a one-night stand on Halloween, and Win ends up being pregnant. Now, I don't always love accidental pregnancies in books. In fact, usually I really hate it. But in this book, I was really convinced that they would have eventually fallen in love and had kids anyway. They just did things a little out of order. After Win finds out she's pregnant, she tracks down Bo, who is a mutual friend, and he really wants to be involved in the baby's life and involved in the pregnancy in general. So he tells her that she can move in with him, and they end up becoming roommates and best friends. Win, for some reason, is convinced that they should not be a romantic couple, even though they're best friends and they like deeply love each other, and they're living together and they're having a baby together, and they're like lusting after one another for almost the entirety of the book. And despite that, despite the fact that they're both so dumb about how in love they are with each other, I was so enamored with these characters. Their banter, their relationship is so sweet, and also the way that they connect over their limb differences. Honestly, the conflict in this book was basically non-existent, and usually that would really bother me, but in this case I didn't even care, because I loved these characters and I loved their romance so much. It was just so sweet and kind and caring and perfect to escape into, and one that I definitely recommend. And last but not least, I'm going to talk about Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. I read both Part of Your World and Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez, and I loved how she's able to balance both darker emotional topics with really sweet, wholesome, fluffy romances, both in this book and in Part of Your World, although I personally preferred Yours Truly a little bit more, mostly because of the characters. This is a book about first impressions and second chances. We follow our main character, Brianna, who's a doctor, and there's a brand new doctor at her place of work who is most likely going to get the promotion that Brianna so desperately wants, so she hates him. Add that to the fact that Jacob, this new doctor, is super rude to her when they first meet. Brianna is, of course, going to despise him until he writes a letter to apologize to her, and they end up writing letters back and forth until they become really good friends. The two of them end up pretending to be a couple, and it is so sweet. I really love a letter-based romance, which is maybe illustrated by the fact that Divine Rivals was on this list earlier, but I also love a fake dating romance, and so this was just such a perfect mix of the romance tropes that I really love. Plus, a lot of this book is about Jacob's social anxiety and how his shyness and anxiety leads him to make kind of some negative first impressions sometimes, just because people don't understand him at first. And so I found him to be a really relatable character, and I loved reading about him. Also, I read this book pretty soon after going through a super devastating breakup last year, and I just really needed something to escape into into, and I couldn't put this book down. So it felt like this book and these characters were really there for me in a difficult time, and I'm really glad that I read it. My last genre is mystery thriller. First is Gone Girl. This is a book that I've been meaning to read for what feels like forever. We follow our two main characters, Nick and Amy, although in the first chapter Amy is missing and Nick is being blamed for either her disappearance or for her murder. So we're following Nick not only through this criminal investigation, but also we're flashing back and reading Amy's diary entries leading up to present day. I feel like lots of people probably already know the twist to this story, but I didn't know going in, so I'm not going to spoil it. But about halfway through, there's a reveal that just changes everything, and I was so shocked. I loved this book so much. I particularly loved that through the flashbacks you find that both Amy and Nick are pretty villainous, pretty terrible. They had a very dysfunctional relationship, to say the least. And I felt like I really went back and forth in terms of like what character I was rooting for and what I expected to happen. It was just a lot of fun to read. I read it with my friend Chloe, and usually we read like a couple chapters a day, but with this one we were constantly texting each other and saying like, oh, can we read more? Can we read more? Because neither of us wanted to put it down. Next is another very hyped mystery thriller. This is a YA mystery thriller called A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. This is actually being adapted into a TV show soon, and I'm so excited for it. This book follows our main character Pip, and for a school research project she decides to research this very famous disappearance that happened in her hometown a few years ago, where this girl disappeared and was presumed to be murdered by her boyfriend, who died by suicide soon after. But Pip is convinced that he was not actually the one who killed her, and that maybe things aren't exactly as they seem, and so she decides to investigate and try to uncover the truth. But as the book goes on and she gets closer to discovering the truth, more and more dangerous things happen to her as other people try to prevent her from learning what really happened. I really didn't expect much from this. I think because it's a YA mystery thriller, I thought that it would be pretty straightforward, but it was not at all. I was consistently shocked, glued to the page. The audiobook in particular of this was really fantastic. Pip conducts interviews, and so the book uses a full cast and then like sound effects for when she's recording and when she's not. One of the funny things about my reading this book was that I started the audiobook when I was driving with my mom, and I was listening to the audiobook over the car speakers, and my mom did not claim to be interested in this book at all, but we ended up getting like 10 chapters in, and she immediately went to try to download the audiobook as well so that she could listen to the rest of it, because she became just as invested as I did, and we both ended up really loving this book. Last but not least, Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley. This book follows our main character Donis. She lives in a pretty small town in Michigan near an Ojibwe reservation, and she feels like she doesn't fit in either in her hometown or on the reservation, and she ends up witnessing a tragedy. She witnesses the murder of one of her loved ones, and she agrees to go undercover and help with the criminal investigation. So this book is one part really high stakes, fast paced, gripping crime thriller, and also emotional, moving coming of age story. And I thought that it balanced those things so well, while also weaving in so much about Ojibwe tradition that I didn't know about. And it was just a really stunning story overall, and I'm really excited to read more from this author in the future. All right, those are all of my favorites from this year. I had a really good reading year in 2023, and I'm hopeful for more 5-star reads in the coming year. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you. Let me know if you read any of these down in the comments. Let me know what your favorite book of 2023 is. If you can narrow it down, I would love to know. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope you are having the most lovely day. Characters Win and Harry. Oh my gosh, I almost said Win and Bo. That's a different book.